All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for being here despite the lovely weather. It's very tempting also for me. And thank you, Lisa, for organizing this event and letting me moderate. Very exciting, because Sarah wrote a very fascinating book. So today we will talk about images. And what better way to look at it than to look at the image that Sarah drew on the cover of her book. What especially caught my eye is the barbed wire that goes around the image and that frames the picture. And Sarah told me that this represents how pictures are imprisoned by copyright laws. But for me, it kind of meant completely something else when I saw it the first time. And it kind of reflects for me the way images are still in their representational cage. And that kind of overemphasizes the question, what does the image tell us? And so that's what I'm doing here. I'm kind of looking at the image and I'm telling you what I'm seeing and I give you my interpretation of that. Sarah's book helps us to kind of cut through this barbed wire and to look at different ways, what do images do and how do they affect us, and especially how do that images live social lives. This is also very relevant for my own research, where I do research on images, architectural images in the fast urbanization of Egypt. And this kind of helps me, Sarah's book, to see images not how they act symbolically on the world, but also materially, that there's architects in a room working on an image that circulate in real estate, websites, etc. So it's very helpful for me. I'm still busy reading, but I think it's better to hear from Sarah. And so I won't keep you waiting. So Sarah Awad is an associate professor at the Department of Communication and Psychology at Aalborg University, Denmark. Maybe also a quick note on the program tonight. So we have three great discussants, and they will kind of talk us through the life of the image. So the birth of the image, the life of the image, and the death, afterlife of the image. But without further ado, yes, Bil Tawfiq, yes, Sarah.
Yes, thank you very much. And thanks a lot for the organizers, the discussants, and I think I'm very lucky to have a dialogue about a book that's not out yet. So that's really nice. So my presentation today is simply about images and what we do with images. Yes. We use images to immortalize precious moments and keep static what is passing. In an image, we can construct how we see the world and how we imagine it ought to be. We seek images that capture how we feel towards a person or an event. We seek images that bring abstract and distant ideas into a concrete material and also meaningful form. In my research, I've been especially interested in how we use images to protest. I have talked with activists who use posters, caricatures, graffiti, and digital images to advocate for different causes. What is common in their experience is the significance of being seen, of leaving a mark somewhere. And that mark, being in the public space, could represent them and what they stand for. The mark would normally say, "We're still here, we matter, or we still exist." I would like to focus my talk today on the psychological influence and the power of the image to shape our thoughts, emotions, and actions in the society. And why it matters to always question who is seen how they are seen, and who gets to represent whom. But first, we need to consider what kind of visual culture we live in today and how our growing accessibility to image taking, image making, and image sharing through technologies such as smartphone, digital media, and artificial intelligence is changing our relationship with the image. Image production today is not limited to authorities, it's not limited to news agencies or professional photographer or artists. If you have a smartphone and access to the internet and you see an image that you do not like, you can edit that image, you can ridicule it, you can even report it and try to censor it. This change in accessibility presents us with different possibilities, but also challenges. For the hopeful, this increased accessibility we have to images has a democratizing potential. With growing access to representation and documentation, follows a promise to decentralize the control over what is seen, who is seen, and how they are seen. We can see more images of world happenings from the perspective of eyewitness. We can document injustice and state violence and have the tools to look back at authorities and hold them accountable. For the skeptic, however, not everyone has the same tools or platforms for visibility. Governments, news agencies, corporations, and their algorithms still have a privileged access in moderating who is seen and how they are seen. Also, increased accessibility has maybe made us overoccupied with using images all the time. And we use images and self-represent ourselves in personal and public spaces all the time. And some issues, such as corrupt and authoritarian leaders, do not go away by ridiculing their image. We might even risk that turning them into a joke is a way of digesting and taming disturbing phenomena to make it more livable. The abundance of images we live in today has consequences on what an image means to us. There's a common idea about the power of the image and how it is worth 1,000 words. But what happens when we have thousands, if not millions, of images for every world happening? I try to capture this new accessibility and new relationship we have to the image through what I label in the book as the social life of images. Looking at how images vary in their lives, some have short lives with little public attention, some go viral and live on in many different forms to become famous visual symbols we identify with and know. Their lives are dependent on what we do with them and what they mean to us. Can the life of an image tell us something about how ideas develop over time in certain places? To take an example, the image of Pepe the Frog. It started as a comic character in 2006. It was created by cartoonist Matt Furry as an apolitical, laid-back frog, a feels-good man frog, cartoon character. Around 2010, Pepe becomes a popular meme on digital media, used for a variety of expressions. We find sad Pepe, angry Pepe, smug Pepe. And by 2015, it becomes one of the most popular digital memes online. But then, during 2016 US elections, Pepe becomes appropriated and used as an alt-right mascot that was then consequently censored as a hate symbol by the Anti-Defamation League in the US, which then led the artist in 2017 to kill his own famous cartoon character and announce its funeral in opposition to what it has developed into. Pepe's contested life did not end there, however. In 2019, protesters in Hong Kong appropriated it as a protest symbol against the government. The frog took on the yellow construction helmet that was symbolic of the pro-democracy movement. Do you think this frog's life was taken too seriously? What is it about the image that makes it so sensational and threatening that it tempts people to edit, transform, and reshape its life? And if it seems they are losing control of its social life, they want to destroy it and censor it. Maybe a psychology of the image can give us some answers. As a social and cultural psychologist, I look at images as cultural artifacts in our environment. We use them as signs for the exchange and transformation of meaning, but we also use them as tools, material tools, for social and political action. A psychology of the image is concerned with the influence of images on the way we see, the way we think, the way we feel, and how we remember the past and imagine the future. In relation to seeing, through images we construct representations of ourselves, others, and the world, and in so doing we create visibility, mediating what is seen and how it is seen. Visual representations provide one way of making identities, social relations, and social difference visible in a society. However, we do not look at images in the same way. The act of seeing is an embodied and socially situated act that involves choices and biases in relation to where we aim our gaze, what we pay attention to, and what we look away from. Our social position, our environment, and the images surrounding us have an influence on how we learn to see in certain ways. We look after meaning, seek information of high value, something interesting, something important, something funny, that informs where our gaze goes. Our gaze does not only affect what we see, but also what we are blind to. The choices we make in what we see matter. What we decide is worthy of our attention. With digital technologies today, even what appears to be passive viewing of a content online have influence on what is registered as worthy of attention by algorithms, and affects how many others will be exposed to that same content. In relation to thinking, images in comparison to language engage our brains differently and trigger open systems of thinking that relies on flexibility and openness to multiple cognitive and affective interpretations. Images can elicit more emotional responses compared to written text that elicit more analytical responses. Images we are continuously exposed to, even when we do not pay much attention to it, can normalize certain ideas about the world and shape our attitudes and behaviors. For example, a study shows that the mere repetitive exposure of patriotic imagery in news reporting tend to increase rather than decrease public polarization. Images can construct different dichotomies of social positions. For example, us, them, good, evil, normal, abnormal. Like in this Danish right-wing image that draws on historic references from the Viking past to construct a clear opposition between a Danish identity that needs to be protected from a threatening other, that of Muslim minorities. Those images can influence how we think and feel about the world and people around us. In relation to feelings, images' capacity to speak to our emotions lies in how images capture an elaborate idea or feeling and present it in a concrete and immediate form. Negative stereotypical images surrounding us in the environment can influence our self-perception and sense of belonging in certain spaces. Social psychological studies have shown that when people are exposed to images that present a negative stereotype threat to their group identity, they tend to display decreased performance on tasks that are related to that negative stereotype. Images can also frame realities in a way that can help us or constrain us from feeling empathy towards others. In news coverage about refugees, research shows that the dominant visual framing of refugees as anonymized and de-individualized groups of people reduces viewers' ability to attribute unique human characteristics to those depicted. A typical iconic image of illegal migrants is that of the refugee boat. The image shows unknown and unknowable people, making individuals almost invisible. The effective power of the boat image becomes less about the people in it and more about the loaded boat being a sign associated with the threat of invasion and the threat of infection. And studies have also shown that it is especially images provoking fear and anger that mobilize the most engagement on digital spaces, on digital platforms. An identifiable personal image, on the other hand, help us humanize and feel with another human who, like us, also has a face, a body, and a life story. In relation to remembering, images matter not only because of how they make us feel in the moment of seeing them, but also because images influence what we remember, and more importantly, how we remember, and how this remembering influences how we imagine the future. Images simplify events, such as wars, into certain representations that trigger certain reconstructions of memories. Images could be used as weapons by those in power to regulate a community's collective memory, choosing which events and people to be glorified and which to be concealed out of sight and forcibly forgotten. For example, this could be seen in the continuous efforts to erase political graffiti in Egypt after the 2011 revolution, and the persistence of activists in not only repainting and re-documenting the revolution, but also in ridiculing the act of whitewashing by the government. The relationship between images and memory is a complex one. Even when we think of how we use our phones in personal daily lives to document many memories of where we went, who we met with, what we ate, recent research has actually shown that taking pictures instead of immersing oneself in a certain experience can in fact hinder one's memory of the event. I have so far shared few perspectives from images, from psychology on how images can influence us. But it's important to mention that this psychological influence of images is more complex than a direct stimuli-effect relation. Who we are, where we are, the kind of society we live in, and how we respond to different images all play a mediating role in how images can influence us. We do not passively receive images, we actively interpret, produce, share, transform, and even censor sometimes images. So maybe instead of asking what is the power of the image or if images matter, we can ask when and how can we make images matter. If an image can speak louder than 1,000 words, can it still do the same when it is one among millions of other images? Among the millions of images surrounding us, can we talk of a good image, a powerful image, the one that lives on and invites dialogue, the one that influences change? Can we talk of a just image, an image that can give justice to those who are represented in it? In this last part of my talk, I will focus on protest images, images that aim to represent and protest human suffering. Questioning whether image can still help us represent realities, protest realities, and imagine alternative realities. Or is it that the oversaturation with images have made us desensitized to the power of the image? Images can be used at times to protest certain realities. They can expose a hidden injustice through an evidence photograph or contest invisibility by insisting on showing certain people or showing certain ideas. All those images here have become global injustice symbols that bring attention to events involving perceived moral and political transgression. They trigger societal dialogues about collective perceptions of what is right and what is wrong. Many other iconic images can be mentioned here to make the point. Images play a key role in activism. They affirm the right to look and the right to defy a visuality in which looking is deployed by the powerful as a means of repression. Images can pose an invitation for the viewers to pay attention, reflect, and question the rationalizations offered by established powers for mass sufferings. However, is it that such images showing oppression or suffering always do something? It is challenging to argue for the power of the image in a time where wars are lively broadcasted and we see instantly the suffering of others, but the mere fact of representing those realities or protesting them does not seem to influence change or stop the suffering. This raises several questions. How do various representational practices and aesthetic cultural conventions influence which images are recognizable as icons of suffering, as representing grievable lives, and for whom? Another question is, how can we portray the suffering and helplessness of a certain group of people without reducing them to powerless objects of spectatorship? How can we portray one atrocity as shocking and unique enough to trigger action against it, yet as common and shared enough to trigger solidarity and intersubjectivity? Images of human suffering present us with a shock effect. They show vividly the unspeakable. This response is not sustainable, however. Shock can quickly be replaced by numbness. When such images become widely circulated and abundant, they can have a counter effect. They normalize certain atrocities. And after repeated exposure, we can become desensitized to the shock effect. Even more, the viewer can learn to look away, not necessarily because of indifference, but because they are afraid of feeling helpless, to not being able to stop what they now cannot unsee. But even when images manage to trigger sympathy, if that is the only response they trigger, that could paradoxically further limit how we can engage with and act in response to what we see. As Susan Sontag argues, images give us the sense of an imaginary proximity to the victim. But this proximity is not true. It is our privileged viewing position that allows us to feel sympathy. When we feel sympathy, we feel that we are not accomplices to what caused the suffering. Our sympathy proclaims our innocence in a way, as well as our impotence. It could prevent us from a reflection on how our privileges are located on the same map as their suffering, and may, in ways we might prefer not to imagine, be linked to their suffering. So, what can make an image matter then? I would argue that images matter when we engage with them in ways that can help us and others see, think, feel, remember, and imagine in a multitude of ways, opening up dialogues rather than educing silence. Those acts of reflexivity can make certain images still matter in a visual culture where we learn to look away. I end here with 3 ideas of what I would suggest can make image matter in today's visual culture. And the first point is that I would suggest we should not expect too much from images, actually. Images can do something in the everyday politics of visibility, knowledge, and meaning making and meaning exchange. Those processes can subsequently and over time influence and facilitate new ways of seeing and acting that can further influence broader social, political, and structural changes. Expecting images to do a direct effect on a structural level, to stop a war, or to bring about equality is not only misleading and naive, but it also misdirects social action. It drives the focus of social action towards representational struggles rather than much needed political action addressing social structures of inequalities and violence. We cannot make revolutionary structural social transformations through images, but we can create many instances of rupturing encounters that challenge the status quo and invite us to entertain the idea of alternative futures. Which brings me to the second point. Maybe images are best used as tools for imagination. Images do not only represent realities that we live and see, or ones that are far away and unfamiliar, but through images we create what we want to see and want to imagine. We create images to embody the abstract and invisible ideas we would like to see with our own eyes in the world. Images can matter when they help us imagine and act towards an alternative future. We can represent existing social realities while simultaneously communicating something new that triggers critical thinking about those realities. We can redefine the boundaries of what is seeable and what is thinkable. Through images, we can make the unfamiliar familiar, or maybe even more, we can connect the unfamiliar to the familiar. We can engage with images in ways that resist mere consumption. And for the last point, maybe we need to start seeing differently. The technological development in our visual culture requires also a development in the way we see. Critical seeing, or oppositional gazes, as Bell Hooks calls it, can help us engage with images differently. It's about engaging in critical visual literacy despite images' mastery in distortion and manipulation. It is to find a space to be reflective and attentive in a modern society that does not afford that space. We can reflect on who put which image where and why. What does the image show? What does it conceal? And who caused what the image shows? We can engage in remembering as an ethical act that does not only help us remember the past, but it also orients future possibilities. An image alone cannot repair our ignorance about history. What actually happened beyond the image? Who caused the suffering? What happened to the victims afterwards? Images cannot be more than an invitation to pay attention and think about whether it was inevitable, was it excusable, is it still continuing to happen in other parts of the world? A static way of recalling an event through a snapshot can hold us in a moment, unable to move forward or to reconcile. while engaging in constructive remembering can help us imagine a better world beyond what happened. A just image does not have to give the full picture or the final say, because no image can. A just image is one that we can open a dialogue through, one that we can facilitate a narrative beyond its representation, and one that we can cognitively and effectively share a reality through. A just image is one that we can co-construct through it a world that resonates with us and with others. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. That was beautiful. Now we go to Olga Eijsele. She's an assistant professor at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research here at the UvA, and her work examines political crisis communication, focusing on the European Union and the challenges facing democratic organizations. Thank you.
Let me just set myself up. Because in this digital age, I have all my notes, thank you, on my computer. So, first of all, thank you, Lisa, for inviting me for this. And thank you, Sarah, and congratulations on a very inspiring book that I had the pleasure of reading on the birth of the image. So basically about the motivations of communicators, what I call it. So that very nicely also connects to my own work, which is, as Joost has just told you, more on communication, more from a social science perspective, and more about political communication and communication of basically any sort of organization, from a very quantitative approach. So there I already wanted to, contrast our approaches a little bit, because I realized at some point that you had an approach of, how people use images as tools, as you said, right, to bring across like a political message, and you also interviewed them, and you really interviewed them about their motives, like why did they put certain things on the picture and all of that. I realized that for me, in my approach, this is so much more difficult to do, because I usually look at, the communication of governments, or media coverage, or the communication of companies, or something like that. And there it is so much more difficult to actually go and ask people why they really did something, right? Because for them, it's usually a very strategic decision to say, I use this picture because it makes the company look good, for example. Or I use this kind of picture because I want to come across as a very, approachable minister of whatever, internal affairs or something. And usually what the difficulty then is, even if you interview these people, even if you get access to them, right, then it's very likely that they will not be completely honest with you, because they do have certain strategies of dealing with the public. So I felt that there was quite a different approach than we had. Also, as you said, in terms of mediatization, the importance of being visible, the importance of, especially on social media, being visible, engaging people. So governments, companies, actually everyone needs that kind of visibility, right? So from my angle, basically, we would always look into this as a strategy to be visible, to frame things in a certain way, and to really basically look good, right? And to, as Lisa is also doing in her work, maintain legitimacy, right? To really justify things to people and to make them understand why certain decisions were taken, for example. Okay, so that more to the different approaches that we had, which I already found super interesting. So what I would like to do, I already told you beforehand that I found this very inspiring, and I had difficulties structuring my thoughts in a way that I could also share them with you here without just wandering off to different associations that I have. So I will try to really structure myself. So the first thing I found super interesting was the icon of Nefertiti with the gas mask. So I should say that my partner studied ancient Egyptology, so then we immediately started talking about this, and it was quite interesting. And I realized that, ancient Egypt in a way is the only, how can I say, non-colonized, superpower, not colonizing superpower in Egypt, right? So then I found this super interesting that you, as a political activist, who's basically about saying that we matter and we're still here, that you go back to that ancient age, where basically this could also be read as representing the core Egyptian identity. And I don't want to go too much into this because I'm obviously not an expert in that. And I also don't want to, impose my interpretations in that sense. But I found this really interesting that it had a very complex message, right? So that you put this very ancient symbol of a revolutionary queen, as you write, a queen that also really interrupted society in a way and just, decided together with her husband to basically invent a new religion and make a new city. Well, they were basically erased from history afterwards, right? But it still was so disruptive that it has left a very distinct mark on ancient Egypt or the history, so that people have given this like its own name, basically. So I found this really interesting how it was connected to this very modern way of protecting someone from the police state, right, from the oppressive state, and this interplay between core identity, but then actually living in today's Egypt and being somehow trying to protect yourself from this police state. So I found this a very interesting tension in a way. And connecting your work a little bit more to my own, basically. I did this on an analysis of visuals in EU communication on social media. So basically thinking a little more about how the EU uses images in their social media communication. And I've worked on the EU for quite long. So this desire basically to look into this came from the fact that the EU is always, whenever you read anything about the EU, is usually either the EU is in crisis or it's just bad, or people don't know a lot about it. So it's always very difficult in a way. So then we thought maybe images are a way of creating a more direct channel, right, to people that experience the EU as very far away. So that's why we chose basically the most direct channel that we could find. So that's visual communication on social media. So circumventing journalists, and then taking a very effective way of talking to people. And then we just wanted to see how that works. And we did that by looking at image types. And I'm just mentioning this here because I want to come back to this later. So while we were doing all of that, one thing I found particularly interesting is the difference between different modalities in terms of complexity. So I think you can transport very complex messages via a picture, right? But as you already said, this is more of an affective complexity. So I think in the Netherlands we have for some time now had a campaign for speaking up about domestic violence. And there is basically only a picture there, right? That there is a victim of domestic violence, and there's actually not much text about it. It just says something like, you have something to say or something to talk about. And you immediately know what this is about, although, as you said, it's very basically unspeakable, right? So it's very hard to put in words. In contrasting this with, the text modality, where you can also transport very complex things, but in a very different way, so in a much more cognitive way. So I found that really interesting. And one example we had there was a study that was about electoral campaigning. And because they, of course, want to reach younger people and just people on social media in general, they were also doing this on Instagram. And now imagine Instagram as this platform that is very visual, right, and very aesthetic in a way, and engages people via pictures. And now you have to somehow also bring across some sort of message, right, because you cannot just put the mugshot of your candidate there and then have people like that, basically. So what they did to circumvent this visual logic is basically just to put text on the picture. So then they embedded the words in there and then circumvented this logic, which I found quite clever in a way. Sorry. Yeah. So in that sense, I found this interesting how you have the cognitive complexity that you somehow need to also impose on a picture sometimes. And then you have the emotional complexity that is often very difficult to put in words. So I found that, interesting, especially for someone like me who basically comes from text analysis, right? So I was very used to analyzing everything in text, and then suddenly pictures came along, and I realized how different that actually is. And with that complexity in mind, I felt that especially for something like a meme, like the ones that you also had in your chapter 4, I believe, I realized how important it is to really be immersed in the context in order to decipher everything on the picture. So you have this lying woman there, and then it's in the text it says something like all the Egyptian symbols needed to be put in there, and they're all on the waistline of the woman. So then I realized that for someone who doesn't know Egyptian symbols, right, that is really difficult to decipher. So there I just felt like how important it is to be immersed in the context. And at the same time, I always find it very funny and a bit ironic in a way that we, as quantitative scholars, we always try to be very objective, whatever that means. So when we do any sort of content analysis that is basically based on some sort of code book that we've thought about, like, coders just telling us is there a politician mentioned or not in the text and stuff like that, so that we are able to count afterwards. And that is always done on the premise that we can reach some sort of objectivity there, so that we can train coders in a way that they all code the same thing. But then if you look at a meme, for example, and you feel that this is so important that you understand all the context in it, like then you can only hire people that really know that context, basically. But then on the other hand, how objective is it then? If they actually need a very subjective knowledge about this, but they need it in order to code objectively. So I found that very ironic in a way. So that's just something I thought I'd share. And in that sense, let me see. Yeah, one thing also in terms of complexity that I thought about then was, so we did an image type analysis, as I said. So image types, I didn't really know what image types were when I started doing that. So an image type is, for example, a politician shaking hands with someone. That's an image type. Or like the mugshot of the chancellor sitting at the desk or something. So you have certain types of images that always reoccur in a way. Okay, I'm almost done. So just one thing about analyzing these images that I thought about was like, it's always a bit of a trade-off. Do you focus on the whole image and the impression of it, or do you focus on details on the image and you count those? So what we're currently trying to do is basically try to set up a computational analysis of visuals to see what works better. And now, I was thinking a lot of how to wrap up my discussion here. And as I said, I had a lot of thoughts that I found a little difficult to structure. So then I read your sentence that the interpretation of an image is always unfinalized. So I will just leave it at that. Thank you.
right. Next we have Josephine Hugaerts. She's a professor of European Studies after 1800 here also at the UvA European Studies Group. She explores histories of speech and sound in modern democracies, and her research investigates topics from citizenship and political participation to the embodiment of authority in 19th century Europe.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Sarah, for letting us read your magnificent book. So to those of you who haven't had the pleasure of reading it yet, I can heartily recommend delving into it. And I especially found it very useful to have this insight into really looking into a connection between the sort of more experimental kind of practical sort of, psychology of images, which is something I'm not particularly familiar with, and then the kind of work I do, which is a more sort of contextualizing, philosophical, I guess, approach to what images do in society and what they do to us. So the book sort of presents a very holistic way, I think, of approaching seeing as a very human practice, and as a practice that is both embodied but then also very cultural, as a practice that is individual but also very social, and as a practice that is very political but also very effective. So it's doing all these things at the same time, which means that there is an awful lot I could be talking about here, and I've decided to just shamelessly cherry pick and go with a couple of things that struck me as interesting. So roughly I have two big themes in the next 10 minutes. And the first one is to talk about power, which is somewhat self-evident, I guess, but we're going to do it anyway. And I was thinking particularly in terms of, the role of the gaze in constructing power. You have addressed it a bit already, so I'll try to follow up on that. And then secondly, I was sort of interested in how images are implicated in the production of the modern self, in a way. So how this sort of momentum for the creation of something like a modern self from the late 18th century onwards really owes a lot to the production of seeing as a practice in a very particular modern way. Now, as you've already seen in Sarah's talk, the book has a great many examples of really politically salient images that then really show the centrality of visual culture to society and to politics. And one of the points that I found particularly interesting, and again, you've approached this already during your own talk, is this notion of that there might be an ability of the image, that there might be an agency to the image in looking back, which is an interesting kind of thing to try to imagine, right? Can the image look back at us, in a sense? And so this, to a degree, made me think of my own work. So as Joost very kindly introduced me with, my own work is mostly about sound. And when theorists about sound think about the different senses, one of the kind of distinctions they tend to make is that sound is multi-directional and seeing tends to be unidirectional. So I am speaking, but I also hear my own voice. You can all see me, but of course I don't see my own face at the moment. It's a very sort of different way of dealing with the same kind of sense. And then you have, all this theoretization about what does that mean, right? This sort of directionality of the senses. And I was particularly reminded of what Derrida wrote about, this sort of notion of what it means to see and be seen, and particularly for those of you who read Derrida, his encounter with his cat. I don't know how familiar people are with this, but there's a beautiful text by Derrida where he stands in his bathroom naked in front of his cat and feels judged, as we all would, right? You can't look at a cat and not feel judged. But so this sort of led me to this notion of, okay, so if the cat looks back at us, does then the image of the cat also look at us, right? Like, can the image look back? And I think one of the things that your book does really well, Sarah, is it sort of keeps the complexity of power dynamics and the gaze really on the surface, right? It doesn't try to solve the complexities. It doesn't try to sort of solve, our issue of what is the direction of the gaze. It sort of keeps it there. And so there's two things happening at the same time, I guess, with images looking back, or two different things can happen. On the one hand, and this is a very well-known theory, I guess, is that there is such a thing as a colonial or male or European or human or, whatever, suppressive kind of power gaze that produces an other. And that other may be a subaltern, it may be female, it may be racialized, it may be animal, right? It's the act of seeing that is subjugating, in a sense. at the same time, there is an ability to the image to represent, and I mean literally to make present, right? Represent the other himself by facilitating an encounter that effectively humanizes the other, by showing their face, for example. And so this got me thinking about, okay, well then what do we mean by looking back? And you mentioned, of course, Bell Hooks with her notion of the oppositional gaze and this notion of counter-visuality. I think one of the things I really thought about was this Levinasian notion of gazing upon the face of the other. And this moment of encounter being the place where you really recognize the otherness of the otherness, right? The sort of extreme alterity of the other. So there is a sort of complex interplay of power in seeing that also invites us to explore this metaphor further, and I'm hoping to hear more of your thoughts about it. So one of the questions I came away with reading this book is, why is it that, empires write back, feminists talk back, black culture clap backs, but images for some reason look back? And so what does that mean? What is being given back, and does sensoriality count for something here? Particularly from that psychological point of view, I think there's something to be said about these metaphors. So that was my point about power. What the book also made me think about was indeed this notion of subjectivity, right? How was the image implicated in creating the modern subject? And so the kind of research that I mostly do is quite a lot of history of science of the 19th century. And when I see the word subject, I somewhat stupidly, because I should know about political history more than I do, but I immediately think of experimental subjects. And so what you see here is a subject being subjected to laryngoscopy. So someone is looking into this poor man's throat to see whether he can vocalize properly. Now, you write in the introduction that we now produce more images daily than were produced in the whole of the 19th century. I would be interested to know where this number comes from, but it's plausible enough. But I do think that even though there is such a big difference in sort of, this enormous amount of images that we have now and the slightly more manageable one that we have in the 19th century, there is something distinctly modern about this whole story of performing an act of seeing that is suffused with power that I was just talking about. And it is arguably, I think, in the 19th century that the modern self sort of comes to be conceptualized essentially as an observer of the world, an observer of, scientific kind of phenomena. This kind of objectivity that you just described as well is a very 19th century production, right? This notion of, we take a step back and we look, and then seeing, of course, is more objective than touching or feeling or hearing. This is all very touchy-feely and we can't take it seriously. So we create this observer in the 19th century as someone who creates but also consumes and assesses images, but who isn't an image himself. Of course, there's a man looking into someone's throat, but of course the point is not that the other guy would look back. He's not supposed to actually peer back into the doctor's throat, right? And so there is this construction of the modern self as someone who produces others in a very sort of active way. Now I wanted to end my sort of little very cherry-picked talk with one little example of this, and I want to introduce you to my favorite 19th century rabbit. I'm sure we all have our favorite 19th century rabbit, right? This is Bertrand. And Bertrand was the rabbit of a certain Monsieur Laborde, who was a scientist in the 19th century, and he's a kind of rare rabbit that exhibits selfhood at this point. And I have to look at my own slide now, which is very unprofessional, but I'm going to do it anyway. So Bertrand, the rabbit, was present as if he wanted to participate and certainly gave the impression of being interested in my experimental work. His expression and attitude reflected an attitude of curiosity. He would stay on the experiment table for hours, where the object of study, here's an object, not a subject, a dog or a rabbit, was held, as if he was observing them with us. But what always seemed of most interest or intrigue to him were the microscopic studies. I would barely be seated at the microscope before Bertrand would endeavor to get onto the table or onto my shoulder, and he would take the exact same position as the one he had seen me in, pressing his eye onto the microscope's lens. So here's a rabbit sitting on someone's shoulder, peering into a microscope, looking at something, and this sort of creates him as a subject, right? This is when the rabbit becomes Bertrand rather than just a random rabbit or, one of the dogs or rabbits that is on the table. And it's sort of interesting, I think, that this really draws attention to the objectifying kind of quality of making an image. And your book, in a sense, I feel, does almost the opposite, right? It draws attention to the affective rather than the objective elements of seeing. And it creates, therefore, a different way to imagine perhaps a postmodern subjectivity rather than the modern one that I have been describing, and that I think you are sort of subtly quite critical of in the book, but you don't really put forward. So I'm trying to push you towards a bit more obvious critique. So I wonder how that might reconfigure our ideas about this unidirectionality of the gaze, and particularly how the gaze then produces or reproduces power if we look at it in this sort of more affective kind of way. And that is where I will leave you all. I shall leave you with the rabbit as well.
Okay, last but not least, we have Ofra Klein. She's an assistant professor in mediatization and digitalization at Erasmus University, Rotterdam. Her research focuses on the radical right, social media, and online political mobilization.
Okay, I don't have slides. I don't have a laptop. I'm using my phone, which is also very unprofessional. But I'm happy that there is a slide from your presentation to fill up this space. So also thank you very much for inviting me to discuss 2 chapters of your book. I was very surprised to be invited, but very happy, and I really enjoyed reading your, I read 3 chapters, the introduction and 2 chapters. It's not out yet, but I also highly recommend it, and I told you it almost reads like a novel. So it's so well written, and I really enjoyed it. So so thank you for inviting me for that. And the 2 chapters I was supposed to discuss are about the afterlife and the death of the image. I will do it a bit different. I will talk a bit more about your work, and also then tell a bit on what can be helpful for our work. I'm officially a political sociologist, but I work at the communication science department. And I think that, many of us, not just political scientists, sociologists, historians, everyone who works with images and psychologists can have use of your book. So the first of the 2 chapters talked about, still the afterlife of images, let's say. How do images develop? And some images have a short life, a very short life. They are seen by very few people, and then they die out. Well, they are, they don't officially die, of course, but they kind of are hidden, and people don't see them anymore. And other images evolve, and they don't become extinct. And the main question from this chapter, what I understood, was, how do images develop? And what makes some images succeed and other images go extinct, let's say. I like this question a lot because my bachelor thesis a very long time ago was about memes. And you have Richard Jenkins who says, if it doesn't spread, it's dead. So it's very much focused on this idea of dying out or living forward. So what makes an image succeed and what makes others not succeed? And you argue in your book that there's actually, that images initially spread widely if they're able to trigger an effective response. So that's a psychological aspect coming in. And these can be things such as empathy, anger, repulsion, and that makes that some images attract more attention than others in the first place. And a second aspect relevant for images to not die, let's say, is that they can be in some ways or another being appropriated, or people can transform these images. So if you think about memes, you very often see the same template with different texts, or the same text with different templates. Those are usually very easy for people to adopt, and that it makes it, that makes it many different variants of the same image, let's say, are visible on the internet. So an image can live forward, even though the original one is maybe, hidden already. So these are the 2 aspects that make that some images succeed and others fail. So you rely on the metaphor of the virus to explain the success of the memes, and this is, or images in general, but it's very often also applied to the idea of a meme, which is also, the name meme comes also from the gene, so it is not so far away from the idea of a virus. And the idea, similar to these successes of images, the idea of viruses is that there's a host that shares the image, and in order for it to sort of emerge or reach others, there needs to be new hosts that kind of transform these images. So it needs to spread through other hosts. And you say, yeah, this is not the most helpful way to think about images, but I do still think it is quite nice. And the second chapter, I think, was a bit, I will delve a bit more into that, and that was about the afterlife or the death of images. And that's the question, right? Can images die or not, right? The images will always remain to exist in some way or another. So what does it mean when an image dies or not? Does it mean that some images, don't get so much attention anymore? Or does it mean that they're, not allowed to be shared anymore? So, are images dead when they lose their original meaning is something that you mentioned, right? We had seen the Pepe the Frog image, and the fact that actually the cartoonist killed off the image himself. But in a way, the image was the same. The meaning simply changed, right? Because it was first a normal, nice frog, and later on it became a misogynistic frog. So does that mean that the image is dead, right? Or is an image dead when it's simply not allowed to spread the image anymore in the public life? For example, you can think about the swastika, right? When it's not allowed to spread an image anymore, where there's some form of censorship, is that the end of the image? However, of course, the image still exists. So I thought it was a very fascinating work, because it touches upon the question, which is what is deemed to be offensive and what needs to be made invisible. And this is something that I work on myself. I work a lot on content moderation as well, which is done by platforms. And then certain decisions are made about what people can see online, what people can post online, what is allowed and what is not allowed. And those who can censor it can be many different people. So you say it can be normal people, but it can be governments, it can be platforms. And the aim of this censorship is sort of to decide what can people see and what can people not see. So it's managing an image of something and determining what people also think about a certain issue, right? So, for example, right, you also mentioned the removal or the discussion of removal of statues. And we also in Amsterdam have had this discussion, or in the Netherlands, and still do, but a few years ago it was quite heavy. And could the idea of removing these statues be seen, it is a form of censorship in a way, and it is an idea that you sort of kill off a certain image of the past that you don't think is appropriate. And these are sort of explicit forms of censorship. But what I liked very much is that you say, actually, with any image that you post online, there is a form of censorship, right? I think many of you will know when you decide to post an image of yourself, there's a few images that you have on your phone and you rather don't want people to see those, so you decide not to post those. But that is, in a way, a form of censoring and showing a side of you that you like to show to others. So another example you give is, for example, the Gulf War and the representation of photography during this war, and how this was really a selective decision to choose certain ways of framing this conflict and not choosing to show other sides of conflicts which were simply there. So there is an intentional invisibility in this censorship, because you choose to show certain parts and hide others. And therefore, censorship determines what becomes visible to the public eye, as well as what becomes invisible. Now, the nice part as well is that sometimes censorship actually gives more visibility to something. And a nice example that you post there is the Winnie the Pooh example, where Winnie the Pooh was being censored on Chinese social media because it was very often used to compare Xi Jinping And yeah, that was not perceived as so nice. And there's also the example of the gay clown and Putin. So there's many of these small examples. And of course, by censoring them, you actually put them in the spotlight. So censorship might also have the opposite effect. And what these, you also actually showed the example that I mentioned about Pepe the Frog and how it was being used quite differently in Hong Kong and actually as a symbol of hope. So it shows that, what an image means in a certain context changes over time, but also across cultures. And you mentioned also, that you need to really have a cultural, and that's also something I really noticed in my work, you need to have a cultural understanding of the context in order to understand the image. Many people might have seen the Pepe the Frog images without knowing that it was a misogynistic frog. So the book is I think very helpful for scholars in many fields and for political scientists and political communication scholars such as myself. It really provides an insight in the strategic use of images, right? The idea that images can live or die is something that plays a big role on social media. So before the emergence of social media, politicians, for example, really had to communicate mostly through traditional media with their voters. But on social media, they can choose the image, and they censor their image, right? So they choose which images to show to voters and which images not to show. All of this is staged, and it is aimed at having a livable life online, getting as much attention as possible online. And images are always selected and censored. Even though they seem too natural, they are always staged. And second, and also in relation to this, and I don't know if that was part of one of the earlier chapters, in the chapter that I read, you talk a lot about, a bit about this idea of algorithms, right? So what becomes visible, the images we see online and images we don't see online are determined by algorithms nowadays. But they don't only show us images, they also influence how images are produced and what we post. This is also the case, for example, for artists, right? People who want to gain visibility online, companies as well, they need to gain attention. And the way to gain attention is by playing into the way algorithms functions. One way that we know already that algorithms function is similar to what you said, right? Images get a lot of attention if they evoke angry reactions, for example. So to get a lot of attention online, you have to post an image that gets a lot of angry responses, for example. So we see that parties, politicians, but also normal influencers, they all play into this algorithm. So in that sense, they also shape how images are produced nowadays and what we decide to post and not post. So that is my second point. And the last point is a bit methodological in a way, but at Rotterdam we have a visual research cluster, and we also have a lot of people from different disciplines working on images. And when I read the book, one thing I really liked was that it was not simply a theoretical discussion, but a lot of the things you address have to do with the ethical and practical problems of analyzing images. And we've had actually a lot of discussions about all these things that you mentioned in the book at the visual cluster in my work. And I think that many people who work with images, no matter whether we're historians or political scientists, we deal with these problems. So for example, copyright is one issue that you mentioned, right? And I like that one of the chapters starts with an empty image because you could not actually reach the author or the creator of the image, the Pepe the Frog image. And it makes it hard to include certain images, but it does determine what we can show and what we cannot show and what becomes visible. So copyright, but also asking for access. And then a big problem that I encounter when I study the far right is that a lot of content gets removed. And you talk about by platforms. So if you're very extreme, your posts get removed, which is good for everyone who uses these platforms, but bad for scholars who want to research the images, right? And it's not just online, it's also indeed, as you showed, street art being painted over, but protest images on the streets being removed. So what do we do if the object that we study becomes inaccessible? And then how do we deal with sensitive images? And also, how do we deal with images of hateful groups? Do we want to portray them in our work and give them additional visibility? Do we want to discuss them at all? These are, and unintentionally perhaps give them more attention than they deserve. These are all ethical, but also practical issues that I think most scholars are really having problems with nowadays. And I really thought it was great that you brought those together in the book. So thank you very much. And I look forward to the questions as well.
Yeah, I see we're running a bit late, so I'm giving Sarah some time to respond, and then we open the floor for questions.
Yes. Yes. Thank you so much for your commentary and very, very useful, also opening up for much more ideas for me for maybe another book. Maybe I'll briefly comment on some of the points. I'll not be able to cover them all because I think each of you brought several interesting ones. Maybe I begin with the last talk with Ofra, and the copyright is a very hot topic for me, and the idea of the inaccessibility of the image, and as you say also like what images do we want to re-reproduce ourselves, so we become image producers when we tackle them in our own research. And how do we deal with images that socially we are discussing their censorship? You mentioned the example of statues, for example, and I think I would refer back to that idea of my hope in a way in images that that open dialogues rather than close the dialogue, and the idea of bringing visibility to the many layers of histories, and rather than censoring, putting the many different interpretations and contexts of images across time. So I think that was a really very relevant and very also complex issue, right? Of how do we deal with images that that show also things from the past that we don't want to see, or we don't want to celebrate, at least, or glorify. And then, Josephine, you had very, very interesting and very hard questions about the looking and the looking back. And what is happening? Do images look back at us? I stayed a lot with that question because I was inspired also of many different authors that talk about the image agency in a way, and I really tried to stay critical of that, saying, I admire your work, I'm taking a lot of your work, but I don't agree. Images don't have agencies. Images cannot look back. We're having many different looks on the image and new interpretations, and the image can afford some way of looking. It can position us in a certain way, but it's always us also taking up that position, or like Bell Hooks mentions, we decide to look differently, to oppose what the image expects of us. So, and another aspect also of images, what is happening with the image, that directional relationship you mentioned, and with power, what happens again with the growing accessibility and the technological advancement? Like, is it because some of the ideas come when we look at images across time and history, right? There's the idea of production of images, and there's the idea of audience receiving the image. And I try to think, is that the same relationship we have today? Is there an audience for an image? Maybe also my work is influenced by me starting with looking at street art and street posters. So the most, in my view, accessible kind of images. These ones are not in a wired frame. They are not in a museum. If you don't like a poster, scratch it off an electricity box, right? So in that sense, I see that the image is not posing a one-directional relationship ever, and the reacting on the image is not even in the act of seeing and looking, but it's also in a very much material act of producing back, making fun, re-reproducing the image with an oppositional meaning that can kill the image metaphorically even, by exposing a certain layer of its meaning. Yeah, but we can talk about that further. I will stop there with this point, but it's a very intriguing one that I don't have a full or a good answer to. Then with Olga, I was really happy how you brought also the methodological complexity of dealing with images, and I tried as much as possible in the book that I'm not providing one methodological way of approaching images, but seeing the complexity of it and the richness of the many different approaches of how we can look at images. And you mentioned the contextualization of it and how hard it is to interpret images. When I do Danish right-wing communication, I always co-author with a Danish person because I feel like no matter how much I know Danish, no matter how I understand the context, I will need someone with a broader knowledge, contextual knowledge. And I think that's I cannot imagine a way in which we can interpret, analyze images without taking that layer you mentioned with the context. But at the same time, also, we're confronted with data that goes in thousands and continue in thousands every day. If we want to follow one party and their visual production, or if we want to follow one dialogue online or one hashtag about something, then we're seeing thousands of images and videos per day. And going qualitatively will not be the most sustainable one if we want to really capture all that, right? So I definitely advocate for a mixed methodology to try to bring the abundance of images today, not only on digital media, but also in all different genres of images, and this mixed methodology and mixed and interdisciplinary approach that also acknowledges the context, and the context means, again, that there's no final meaning, there's no final interpretation, but it's exactly in the interest of how images will be reinterpreted over and over again in multiple ways, not only across geographical context, but across time, across one individual to the other. I'm getting more and more now into digital media consumerist kind of content and TikTok, and I find it extremely interesting that you would be talking with students from the same classroom having similar interests, as they say, but everyone is seeing a different feed and having different TikTok sides, I think, as it's called. Yeah. So I think I'll stop now.
Perfect, thanks. So I guess we'll open up the floor. So if you have any questions for Sarah or the discussants, just raise your hands and the mic will be passed along. Yeah, I see a hand in the back here.
Hello, I'm a beta scientist. So for me, Bertrand both looks at me and sees me, but it's really getting annoying when this kitten was looking at us. It was like, stop staring at me. Can you explain, please?
Would you like to explain that? To maybe to explain the kitten. I mean, I think the psychologist is better placed here.
I don't know, because in all cases, I thought, is the cat or the rabbit doing anything? Or is it all in us, right? It's how I see myself in your eyes and how you're looking at me now, and then I'm making an interpretation of how you're looking at me. The same way when you say that things are looking at us, I'm looking at you, but I'm not looking at a mirror, so I cannot see myself. But I wonder if psychologically, by the mere fact of looking at people looking at me, I am seeing myself through your eyes, and sometimes I get a sense in a place that, okay, maybe this is not resonating, people are getting boring, and some other times I see some nodding and I feel like, okay, I'm making sense. So I don't know if I'm making sense right now, but I think there's something very relational in how we put meaning on the eyes of the rabbit or the cat. So in a way, how you see them looking at you is big part how you are seeing, how you are interpreting what they are doing. And maybe, just maybe, neither the cat nor the rabbit were really interested in all those things we thought they were interested in. We projected onto them what we think is interesting and what we think the act of looking into the microscope means to us. Does that make sense? Maybe.
I mean, this is sort of what Derrida was on about as well, of course, in the sort of, am I equally naked in front of my cat as I would be in front of a human, right? Which is an interesting question, in a sense. Like, you do feel more naked when an animal is looking at you, even though presumably it doesn't have a concept of nudity, but we don't know.
Yes, thank you for the interesting talk. I was just thinking, when you look at a small child in the tram or in the bus, and you don't even know the child, 1 or 2 years old, and she's gazing or he's gazing at you, and you might think, oh, she's flirting, she likes me. But of course not, this is the biology. And it's the mirror neurons that makes a story about this interaction. It's illusion, of course, like the rabbit, I think.
I think that's actually a good answer to the first question. Yeah.
Thank you for the really nice talk. I was recently talking with my friends about the feminist topic of doing selfies and uploading selfies, and how many people think, okay, the person's just in love with themselves and posting a random image, but it can also be quite a feministic act of women photographing themselves in a mirror or even like with a front camera and then posting this, and how this looking, like you take your own picture of how you look at yourself and then you post it so that other people can see it and put their gaze on it. Did you also think about this kind of feministic act in your book?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I addressed it as much, but I think it's in that idea of self-representation, and when do we pick how we would like to be represented, and how also the same image could be objectifying or the person self-representing and presenting themselves as a subject, despite how others will gaze on it. But it's a decision, and this is how I would like to be represented. And I think what I try to highlight the most is that idea of whatever group of people, whether it's women or a certain community, what are the tools and the visibility in which they are being represented by another, maybe more powerful group or a more dominant kind of representation in the society, and when do they get the means to self-represent in whatever way they would choose to self-represent. And in a way, the whole idea of technological tools, including people's ability of taking selfies and putting things online, was in the paradox I mentioned in the beginning of the talk, that I see it positively, that people are able to self-represent themselves and put the images there that are most resonating with how they would like to be seen, right? But at the same time, also I question how much does it change dominant ways of seeing different people. And the act of individually putting things online, how does it compare to news agencies, for example, and how they present different groups, again, whichever groups they are, and algorithms and all other factors that make certain representations still more dominant over the other. So I'm not sure if this answers you, but I see a potential in it, but I also question at the same time how much it changes dominant ways of representation and seeing for different groups. Yeah.
Thank you. I have a bit of a train of thought that I'm going to try to explain, because I was very intrigued by your final 3 concluding sort of takeaways. I'm not sure if that's the right word for them. But I like imagery, and my main interest is imagery and protest and sort of the impact of them in political turmoil or conflict. And I was wondering whether, because my experience, it used to also be a lot of protest, quite powerful sort of stance can be also quite silent or passive or inactive. But
it seems to me nowadays that imagery is quite needed in protest in order to sort of create movement, to create sort of visibility. And that when you take away the imagery, also you take away sort of the voice or the protest or the activity, the political activity. So I was, I'm not sure what the question is, but more wondering about your thought about that sort of the change where silence is no longer an option, even visually, and that sort of thinking that you can sort of protest without visual might not even be possible anymore in a, yeah, that's a hard thing to do, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I don't think protest without the visual element. I think the visual element has been always there. Like, even if we think before any kind of this media and documentation tools and smartphones we're talking about, I mean, the whole idea of protesting is a visual and performative act, right? You take over a space by your bodies and you appear in a certain way that is powerful. Maybe now we have it covered and easily taken images of, shared, and therefore more people are mobilized and join. But even before that, before those tools, I think the act of protest is always incorporating at least some visual aspect. So it's not at all to undermine or to take away the visual aspect of it, but rather that I was trying to think, because I think it irritates me a bit when I hear statements like the image that toppled the regime and things like that, right? With the Arab uprising, there was the idea of the Silicon Valley Facebook made Arab Spring. And those statements, I think what it undermines is the history and the long years of underground, extremely risky, real social action that was at work. And to put it at the end on the visual as if that's the one that did it, while it's maybe triggered or tipped something or influenced some mobilization at some moment in time that worked in a certain way. So it's just to be cautious of how we overemphasize sometimes the power of the image. I'm influenced also by Naomi Klein and her work with No Logo, and the idea of when we focus so much on the image and the idea of representation, who's represented and how, and we make that as the cause, then it becomes very problematic, because we say, okay, this group of people is not represented, we don't see them in imagery. Cooperates are the first to really take it in and say, oh, we're very inclusive, here's an ad that has all different colors and shapes of people. But in reality, nothing changed for those groups of people, but now we have the image of everyone, right? So it's just a matter of caution of how much do we put things on image, versus what you're saying is that image is a tool for actual political action, and it's being used in mobilization, it's being used in representing certain things, rather than the image itself being the political action. Yeah.
Okay, we have space for one more question. Or not. Yeah.
Thank you. You mentioned doing justice to images and just images. I wondered, what's your take on the role of universities, science and research in society?
Do you mean in communicating science visually or not?
No, I mean justice is such a normative concept. So if you include it in your research, then I wondered your take on what your research should effect or do in society must be really interesting.
Yeah. No, that's a hard question. I think maybe it relates to your last discussion about what do we also reproduce in academic work in relation to images, and what could be a just image or a just even topic of research. that is worthy of researching. I think I'm going blank. Would you like to help me?
No, I find it a very difficult question. I actually, because this is more about being objective in research while at the same time striving for a certain goal. Is that what you mean?
Yes, how to combine objectivity with thinking about how I do justice to an image, or what is a just image.
About the image part, I don't know. I think the discussion itself about objectivity and science is quite interesting, of course, and at the same time there's sometimes maybe also a struggle, because of course we sometimes need to do very societal relevant research. So in a way it has a goal, but I don't know about the just image. I haven't actually thought about that, so maybe you have a better idea. No, you also don't know.
I mean, this now feels very weird because I'm genuinely answering to my own PhD student, which is a bit odd. This is not something we usually discuss, bizarrely. Maybe we should. But one of the things that I have found very, very helpful in terms of thinking about what you reproduce in your research, and I think imagery is very tricky in that regard, because you can't really talk about an image without showing the image. It's this sort of dancing about architecture kind of problem, right? You have to show something in order, and then you have all these very sensitive kind of images that on the one hand, you may not necessarily have the consent of the subject of the image, but also not the consent of the person watching it. The sort of what do I want? And so I do find indigenous research in that sense very sort of inspiring in terms of thinking through what benefits or at least doesn't harm the community this research should help forward, and whether that is the European Union or what is the kind of community you talk to, I guess is one way to sort of think about, okay, what is a just image to show here, and to what extent does it need to be shown, or is it fair to be shown, both in terms of the subject and the audience, which indeed changes depending on where you publish or where you show your work or whatever.
All right. Thank you all for being here. Just a quick note on Sarah's book. It will be out in November, so we have to wait a little bit longer. But yeah, keep your eye out because it's great work. Thank you. Bye-bye.